speak today. And of course, I told him I would. Um, I'm originally from Philadelphia. Grew up going to Spring Creek Baptist Church, and Shane and his family went there for a few years, and so got to know them and love them. And I know you all love them and are thankful that they're here this morning. And if you want to go ahead and turn to Judges chapter 13, that's where we're going to start. Judges chapter 13. This is a sermon that I've actually preached before, but I heard a preacher say one time, sometimes my sermons just need a second chance. So maybe this is a second chance for this one this morning. We're going to be talking about a guy that you've probably heard of before. It's a guy named Samson. But now the story of Samson, I think, is one of those stories that you hear growing up in church when you're younger. Maybe like Daniel in the lion's den, or Jonah and the big fish, Noah and the ark, something like that, that maybe you haven't heard in a while. I don't know, maybe you heard it last Sunday or something. I don't really know, but a lot of the times these stories we hear as children and we grow up and we forget about them. But this one, it's interesting because when we think of Samson, I think a lot of times our minds immediately go to Samson and Delilah, right? And from that aspect, we get the idea of Samson, who was deceived by this evil woman, Delilah, who cuts his hair and he loses his strength. And while Delilah is an evil woman that cuts his hair, Samson's not innocent here by any means. We're going to talk about Samson's life and Samson's fall from what Adrian Rogers says, how he goes from hero to zero really quick. What I want to talk to you about today is the idea of drifting away from God. What does it mean to drift away from God? What does it mean to drift? So I want you to picture this. You're on a boat out in the ocean, and you're not far from shore, and you haven't anchored down or anything. You're not planning on being out there too long, but all of a sudden you're just laying out and you fall asleep. And 2 hours later, you wake up burnt to a crisp and just out in the middle of nowhere. All you see is water around you. You can't see the shore. You don't know how you got there, and all of a sudden you begin to panic. Okay? Sometimes in our walk with Christ, sin invades our lives, and we begin to drift away from God. We begin to go out into the depths of the ocean to where we can't see the shore anymore. We can't even hear God's voice anymore because we're so far out. And I want you to see Samson's mistakes that he makes in his life and how it leads to his final destruction and how hopefully we can learn from his mistakes. I've always found it's a lot easier to learn from somebody else's mistakes than to make them yourself and try to learn that way. And so we're going to look at that. Going to be starting in Judges chapter 13, and it goes through Judges 16. I'm going to tell you this. I'm not going to read 3 chapters of Scripture today. I know that y'all don't want me to. I don't really want to. I'm not a big reader myself. Also, I work with youth. Okay, so I realize that like on Wednesday nights in an hour that I have with youth, maybe 20 or 30 minutes of that is spent teaching, and maybe like 5 or 10 are spent on the time that they're actually going to listen and key in and understand what you're saying. Maybe we'll have a little bit more time this morning, but I've narrowed it down to about an hour and a half, so we should be out of here soon. But we're going to read, starting in verse 1 of chapter 13, about Samson's birth. So it says, "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord gave them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. There was a certain man of Zorah of the tribe of the Danites, whose name was Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Behold, you are barren and have not borne children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Therefore be careful and drink no wine or strong drink, and eat nothing unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, and the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines." So Samson is the last judge mentioned in the book of Judges. And when we talk about a judge in the Bible, we're not talking about the guy who sits behind the podium and swings his gavel down and tells you you're going to jail. That's not that kind of judge. This kind of judge is someone who has come to help set the Israelites free from the captivity they're in. In this case, they're in captivity of the Philistines. And so Samson's life mission, what he's sent here to do, is to be a judge for Israel, to get them out of captivity of the Philistines. And so we start off when we see that his mother is barren, she can't have children, and then all of a sudden God's going to allow her to have a child. And if you've ever noticed some things about the Bible, there's a lot of women that are mentioned as being barren, and then they have children. Okay? One that comes to mind, Abraham and Sarah. Sarah was barren. She was like almost 90 years old. Abraham's almost 100, and then all of a sudden she's able to have a son. God says you're going to have a son, and Sarah just laughs at him. She says, I'm 90 years old. I'm not going to have a child. Well, she has Isaac. most of the time, these kids, they end up being pretty important people. Isaac was pretty important. You skip a generation, you go to Jacob. Jacob worked for 7 years to get a wife named Rachel, and then her dad tricked him and gave him Leah. So he worked 7 more years and finally got Rachel. And then Rachel was barren. She couldn't have children. And then all of a sudden, God allowed her to have children. And her first child was named Joseph. And as far as I'm concerned, anybody named Joseph is important. If you didn't get that, my name is Joseph. If you still didn't get it, maybe you'll get it later. But you move on and you talk about a woman that wasn't necessarily barren, but she was a virgin and was not able to have children. And then she birthed Jesus. And if you don't know about him, you should read about him. He's a pretty important person too. So this woman is barren. She's going to have a child. And just like every other one, right, he's going to be an important person. He's going to be a judge for Israel. So Samson comes about. He's going to be a Nazirite. What is a Nazirite? Well, a Nazirite, it means to be set apart, to be different. We know as Christians we're supposed to be set apart and different from the world, right? And so he's supposed to be set apart. The ways that he's supposed to be set apart, there's some criteria for a Nazirite. He wasn't supposed to eat any unclean food. Now this goes back to the Levitical law that they lived by, the cleanliness of food. He was not supposed to eat any unclean food. He was not supposed to drink any alcohol. No haircuts. Couldn't cut his hair. We know Samson is the guy with the long hair. And, it's funny when you think about Samson. I've always thought he was like this guy who looked like the Incredible Hulk, but he wasn't green, right? And he's got this long hair. Maybe he looks something like Fabio. I don't know. But I heard a preacher say this and started thinking about it. So Samson's name, by the way, means sunshine, which is kind of ironic because we think of Samson as this big, strong guy, and his name means sunshine. But his name means sunshine. I think maybe Samson was just a normal-looking guy. You think about when Delilah starts asking, where do you get your strength from? If he's a guy who looks like the Incredible Hulk, she obviously thinks, oh, he probably works out. But she just keeps asking, where do you get your strength from? Where do you get your strength from? Maybe he's just a normal-looking guy with long hair, and his name means sunshine. Stay with me here. Has anybody seen the movie Remember the Titans? You know what I'm talking about? There's a guy that comes in from California, and he's got the long blonde hair, and he's a pretty boy, and everybody calls him Sunshine. Maybe Samson looked like Sunshine from Remember the Titans. Maybe he didn't. I don't know. It's fun to think of it that way. But, so he wasn't supposed to cut his hair, right? We know Samson's got the long hair. And the last was he's not supposed to touch dead bodies. Now, I don't know if this just applies to human bodies or animal bodies too. If it's just human bodies, I don't have a problem with not touching dead bodies. That's not a big deal. But we're going to see later in the story how this kind of comes into effect, because Samson will begin to break some covenants with God, okay? And we're going to look at Samson having some eye problems. I'm not talking about astigmatism, okay? He's got 3 main eye problems we're going to look at today. And the first one we're going to see at the beginning of chapter 14. Beginning of chapter 14, starting in verse 1, it says, Samson went down to Timnah, and at Timnah he saw the daughters of the Philistines. Then he came up and told his father and mother, I saw one of the daughters of the Philistines at Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife. Now, Samson, it just says that he sees the daughters of the Philistines, right? It doesn't say he went and talked to them. It doesn't say he went and got to know them. See, Samson's first eye problem, and it's going to come back and bite him again and again and again, he has lustful eyes. Okay? This is a downfall for a lot of men, including Samson. He has lustful eyes. He sees this woman. All right? He doesn't go and talk to her. He doesn't go and get to know her. He doesn't check her Facebook page to make sure she's posting Bible verses, because that's what makes you a Christian. Right? He just sees her. He says, this woman looks good. So he goes back and tells his parents, look, I found a woman in Timnah, and I want you to get her for me. Look at what his parents say, though. It says, but his father and mother said to him, is there not a woman among the daughters of your relatives or among all our people that you must go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistine? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, for she is right in my eyes. Samson's father and mother, good Christian people, they realized that you should not be, as it says in 1 Corinthians, you should not be unequally yoked. Okay? So this woman is not a Christian. She's not of the tribes of Israel. She is a Philistine, and they realize this, and they try to steer Samson away. And look, he says, get her for me, she's right in my eyes. Samson just tells his parents what they're going to do for him, right? And maybe if you're Samson and you can do all these incredible things, you can do that. But I don't know if many of you know my dad. He's here today. His name's Joey Blount. If I had told my parents what they were going to do for me, well, let's just say I may not be here today. But Samson gets away with it, right? His father and mother, this was their thought process. They thought maybe, just maybe, Samson is trying to marry into the Philistines, and he's going to, kind of take them down from the inside, right? And so they allow it. They say, okay, we're going to go with it. As the story goes, later on, Samson is found in a vineyard. Now, as a Nazarite, he was not supposed to drink alcohol, and in fact, Nazarites tried to steer clear of grapes at all because that's what was used to make wine. Yes, they had wine in the Bible, not Welch's grape juice. But Samson was in a vineyard, and it doesn't say that he's drinking wine in the vineyard. However, it lends us to believe that he's doing something that he's probably not supposed to be doing. Okay? One thing I want you to understand is that the situations that you put yourself in dictate how people will perceive you. Okay? The situations you put yourself in will dictate the way people will perceive you. If you go out and party and, maybe you don't even drink, but you go out and party with people. People see you there, and they assume maybe you drink, maybe you getting drunk on the weekends. Sometimes you don't even have to be doing the wrong thing. How many of y'all have been to the Neshoba County Fair, and you're out there holding a red Solo cup, and you've got water or sweet tea or Dr. Pepper or something like that in it, and somebody's got to come up and be funny and, hey, buddy, what you got in that drink with the cup there? They joking with you, but for every person that jokes with you, somebody else may see you and just say, I didn't realize they drank like that. Okay. And I'm not saying you can't hold a red Solo cup at the Neshoba County Fair. I'm just saying people will perceive you and think of you based on where you put yourself. If you go to the bars and hang out, people are going to think of you as someone who just goes to the bars and hang out and get drunk all the time, right? And so Samson is here, and he gives us this idea that maybe he's not where he's supposed to be. And as he's here, he gets attacked by a lion. Now, Samson doesn't have any kind of AK-47 to shoot this thing down with. He doesn't have a knife to stab it with or anything like that. But he just kills this lion with his bare hands. So we know Samson is strong and has incredible strength. I didn't realize he'd kill lions with his bare hands. This is pretty crazy. I mean, we know the story of David, and he killed a lion with a slingshot, but, I mean, he had somewhat of a weapon, right? Samson just uses bare hands, and he kills this lion. Well, later on, he's going to come back by this lion, and there's going to be bees have made a nest, and there's honey in there, and he reaches down and scoops up some of the honey, and this is where it gets kind of tricky, because some people will say, well, that's breaking a covenant with God. He touched this dead body of this lion. Some people say it's only referring to humans. Either way, once again, he lends us to believe that maybe he's not doing what he's supposed to, right? But we go ahead, and he's gonna get married to this woman, and they have a feast. Okay, this is a week-long feast, 7 days of feasting. Now, I don't know about y'all, but that's right up my alley. I love to eat. But the problem is, diabetes runs in my family, so by the third day of a 7-day feast, I'm probably going to need to be shooting up with insulin or something because it's going to be bad. A 7-day feast, and while they're there, Samson's hanging out with these men. There's 30 men there. Some of this woman, some of her brothers and relatives and friends, maybe just some guy off the street, I don't know. But there's 30 men there, and they're hanging out and having a good time. And Samson loves riddles, okay? A few things about Samson. He was well-liked, okay? He loved riddles, and he was smart, quick-witted guy. You know, he was the kind of guy that would walk into a room. I think he'd walk in and start shaking everybody's hands and cracking jokes with them and things like that. I mean, his name is Sunshine, so maybe he walks into a room and it just kind of brightens up, right? Y'all probably know people that leave a room and it brightens up. We're not going to point any fingers this morning. But Samson, he's there telling riddles to these guys, okay? And he makes a bet with them. And he says, I'm going to give you a riddle, and if you can figure it out, I'll owe you 30 garments of linen. Now, what does this mean? Well, this is some clothing that's probably a little bit expensive. So we're gonna think about it as like buckle jeans, right? Y'all ever bought buckle jeans? It'll hurt your pocketbook really, really bad. And so these guys, he says, I'm gonna give you 30 pair of buckle jeans if you can figure out this riddle. And he gives them this riddle, and he says, out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet. Now, what he's talking about is the lion. Out of the eater, which is the lion, came something to eat, which was that honey. Out of the strong, the lion, came something sweet, the honey. And so these guys have no idea what he's talking about. And there's a bet on the line here for 30 pair of buckle jeans, okay? These guys don't want to have to buy that and give it to Samson. So they can't figure it out. Finally, they go to the woman he's going to marry, and they threaten her. They basically say, you need to find out what this riddle means or else. So she goes back to Samson, begins to beg and plead and beg and plead. Finally, he gives in, and he tells her what it means, what is sweeter than honey, what is stronger than a lion. So she goes back and, of course, tells the men. They come a few days later, and they tell Samson, we figured it out. And they say what it means, and Samson realizes right off the bat they didn't figure this out. This woman has told them what it means. And listen to what he says here. In chapter 14, verse 18, end of it, he says, "If you would not plow with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." Now, men of all ages, boys, teenagers, grown men, look, I'm not married. I have a girlfriend. I would like to keep her. One thing that I've learned in my life is that women don't like to be called heifers. If your name is Samson and you can kill a lion with your bare hands, maybe you can get away with it. But for the rest of us, this is not a smart thing to do. But he says, "If you would not plow with my heifer, you would not have found out my riddle." He knew that they went to his woman. He knew that they went there and asked her, and so it was like they cheated, right? But he knew he had to pay back this debt, these 30 pair of buckle jeans, right? So he goes out and he kills 30 men and takes the garments off of them and pays back his debt and goes home. I mean, he's furious. He's enraged. He goes out and kills 30 men, once again with his bare hands. Now he's killed 30 men in a line with his bare hands. But he goes home, takes some time and cools off, and he comes back. And he goes to the house of this woman, her father's house, and I just picture him knocking on the door, her father coming to the door and immediately being frightened because there's Samson, the man that just killed 30 Philistine men. And he says, "I'm here to get my woman back," and he says nervously, well, I thought you hated her when you left, so I've already given her away. And then he starts thinking, but you can have her sister. Her sister's free. I mean, he's afraid that he's going to get mad and kill him now, right? But Samson, he doesn't want her sister. He leaves, again, furious. He goes out and he finds a couple of foxes and he ties their tails together and he puts a torch in between it and he sends them out into the field and they burn up all of their harvest, all of their wheat and grain and whatever else they were growing. And I know there's some people in here who have grown a garden before. And you know that it is hard work to grow a garden and keep a garden, to pick the beans and the peas and butter beans and to keep the weeds out of it and to keep the crows out of it and all that different stuff. And imagine somebody coming and setting fire to it. And just everything that you've worked so hard for is up in flames. You would be pretty upset about it, wouldn't you? Well, the Philistines were pretty upset too. So they send for Samson. They're going to come and get Samson. They send 1,000 soldiers to come get Samson. And the Israelites hear about it and they go to Samson and they say, "Look, we don't want to be in the middle of this. You need to turn yourself in." So Samson goes and he turns himself in when the men get there. They bind him up and they start to take him back to wherever they're going to take him. And on the way back, Samson just breaks out of the restraints and he hops up and the first thing he finds is the jawbone of a donkey. It's just casually laying out there on the road. So he grabs it and picks it up. And these men start to come at him and he starts to hit them with this jawbone. And before it's all said and done, he's killed 1,000 Philistine soldiers. I mean, it was impressive enough that he goes and kills 30 Philistine men with his bare hands, right? I mean, that's impressive. But now, with just the jawbone of a donkey, he kills 1,000 Philistine soldiers. These are men who are soldiers. They're fighters. They know how to fight. And he just kills all of them with nothing but the jawbone of a donkey. His body count now is up to 1,030 men and a lion. The only thing he's used is the jawbone of a donkey, right? And so he's just, he's really impressive if you haven't figured that out. But here's what happens, okay? We've seen Samson get himself in trouble with his anger, with his lustful eyes. We're going to see his second eye problem is pride, okay? What I mean by that is he cares about I, right? He thinks highly of himself, of I. And that says the second eye problem is his pride. We know the Bible says that pride come before the fall. We're going to see it happen in this story because here's what's happening with Samson. He continues to sin. He continues to get further and further away from God, and things continue to happen. He gets attacked by a lion, right? The Philistines come to capture him, and each time something bad happens, each time he gets himself in a mess, he gets himself out of it with his strength. And because of this, he begins to get a little more prideful. He begins to think a little bit higher of himself because he keeps getting himself out of these situations, right? He starts thinking he's big and bad and all of his strength is, he's invincible, he's unstoppable. And the same thing happens to us. When we live in sin and we don't get caught in it. Okay? The Bible tells us your sin will find you out, but a lot of times we ignore that because we're in a sin and things are going great. Nothing bad has happened. Nobody's found out about it. We think that we are good. We think we can't be touched. until everything comes falling down, right? Samson is in the stage right there in the middle where he thinks he can't be touched. He thinks nobody can defeat me. I am invincible. I am unstoppable. And it's a dangerous place to be because he's very prideful. And it continues. Beginning of chapter 16, we see Samson with those lustful eyes again getting him in trouble. It says Samson went down to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute and went into her. Samson found a prostitute in Gaza, and he sleeps with her that night, breaking in yet another covenant with God, his purity. As the story goes on, while he's in Gaza, the Philistines hear about it, and they send men to surround the city. So when he wakes up in the morning, they're going to capture him. They're going to come in and take him. Only problem with that, Samson wakes up in the middle of the night. And I imagine him going out there and seeing all these men around the city. And here's the thing about Samson. He's very prideful, right? He wants you to know who you're messing with, okay? He could have easily probably just sneaked off in the night because all these guys are asleep and waiting for the morning to come so they can capture Samson. He could have easily done that. Instead, he had to prove himself. So what he does is he picks up the city gate, the post and all, just picks it up out of the ground. All right? If that's not impressive enough, he carries it from Gaza up the hill to Hebron. Now, I'm not talking about just up a little hill. I'm not even talking about just up the mound, right? I'm talking about he carries it all the way to Hebron, which is 37 miles from Gaza. He had to show his strength. He had to show them who they're messing with. He had to show he's invincible and he's unstoppable, and so that's what he does, to show his strength. And then, later on, we find him with Delilah. And we know Samson loved Delilah. You'll never guess what Delilah's occupation was. She was a prostitute. I think Samson had a type, and it wasn't a very good one. And now, I don't know anything about prostitution, that line of work there, but I would assume that the women that get into that, they don't get into it because it's their dream job, right? They get into it because they need money. They've tried some other things, and they haven't done well in life, and they get to the point where they need money, and this is an easy way for them to make it. And so the Philistines find out that Samson and Delilah, they're kind of hanging out, and so they go to Delilah, and they offer her an amount of money to find out how Samson can be bound up, how he can lose his strength, and how they can bind him up and capture him. So obviously Delilah takes it. And Delilah starts asking these series of questions that to anybody else would seem like red flags, right? But Samson's in love, okay? She goes to Samson one night and she says, Samson, how can you be bound up? How could you be bound up? And he says, if you tie me up with 7 fresh bowstrings, then I'll be just like any other man. So in the middle of the night, she ties him up with 7 fresh bowstrings. And she wakes him up and says, Samson, the Philistines are here. And he pops up and breaks out of those bowstrings like there's just nothing on him. And she begins to say, Samson, how could you lie to me? First of all, I'm thinking, woman, how could you be this crazy? You're going to tie me up with bowstrings. I mean, this is a red flag here, right? She's asking him how it can be bound up, and then she tries it in the middle of the night. I'm thinking, Samson, buddy, you got to get out of there. If anybody's a heifer, it's this woman, right? So you got to run. You got to get out of there. But Samson, he just enjoys playing this little game with her, right? And he says, I'm sorry I lied. In fact, if you just tie me up with new ropes, I'll be like any other man. So in the middle of the night, she ties him up with new ropes. Does the same thing. Samson, the Philistines are here, and so he wakes up and he breaks out of the ropes like there's nothing on him. Samson, how could you lie to me? Again, Samson, run. What are you doing? He just likes playing the game. He says, if you take the 7 locks of my hair and you bind them together and put a pin through them, I'll be just like any other man. So he's getting a little bit closer to the truth now, right? And so in the middle of the night, what does she do? She does exactly what he says. She says, Samson, the Philistines are here. And he hops up and he pulls the pin out. He's just as strong as always. Samson enjoys playing this game. And the thing is exactly what we do with God. Whenever we're stuck in a sin and whenever we think that we're invincible and nobody's going to find out and we're fine, then we can just play this game, right? We can continue to play this game with God, not realizing the power of God. All right, because we've drifted so far out into the ocean, we can't see the shore anymore. We can't hear God's voice anymore. And so, finally, Delilah looks at Samson and she says, Samson, if you love me, how could you lie to me? Oh, man. She hit him with the L word. She said, how could you love me? Love, the word that every middle school relationship is built on, right? The little 8th grade girl that comes in crying and is just devastated because her boyfriend broke up with her, and she says, but he loved me. And how long were y'all together? For like 2 weeks. She says, Samson, how could you say you love me and you lie to me? And Samson's like, well, I'm in trouble now. I got to tell her the truth. No, you don't. You got to run. Get out of there. Because it's easy for us to sit back and say, Samson, you're being foolish. You're being dumb to stay here and live with this woman and to allow her to do this to you. Why are you still here? But it's easy for us on the outside because when we're in sin, we're just like Samson. We don't see the danger that lies ahead. We don't see what's really happening here. I heard this illustration. It's kind of funny to start with. I'm going to throw you off guard with the first word of it. Eskimos. I told you I was going to throw you off guard. Eskimos had problems with wolves in their villages. And so they had to come up with a way to get rid of these wolves. I promise this is all going to tie back together. Just stay with me. So what they did was they would take and kill an animal and drain its blood, take its blood, and they would take a blade. And they would stick that blade in the blood, and then they would stick it in the ice and let it freeze around the blood. They would take it back into the blood and into the ice and repeat this over and over again until they just had it covered with ice and blood, and they'd stick a stick through it and basically make a blood popsicle, right? And they would go and they would stick this in the ice at the edge of the village. And the wolves would smell the blood from ways away, and they would come and they would begin to lick this blood popsicle. And it's pleasing to them, right? They get the taste of blood in their mouth, which is exactly what they want. And they continue to lick away at this blood popsicle until all of the ice is gone. But here's the thing that happens, is that once the ice hits their tongue and they continue to lick, their tongue becomes numb. They continue to taste blood, their tongue becomes numb until they get to the blade. They lick the blade and it cuts their tongue. They can't feel it. All they taste is more blood. And they continue to do this, not knowing that it's slowly killing them until they bleed out and die. Eskimos are pretty smart people. In the same way, we get into sin. And we're just like that wolf because we found something pleasing for us. We found something that we really enjoy, that just seems like it's the best thing. And we become numb to the fact that it's killing us, that it's hurting us, hurting the people around us, to the point that we're sitting there licking the blade and bleeding out and not realizing how it's affecting us. And Samson is here to the point that he's gone too deep. He's gone too far. He's drifted so far away from God, he can't hear his voice anymore. He doesn't realize what he's doing. And so Delilah says, Samson, how could you love me and lie to me? And finally he says, you know what, if you cut my hair, then I'll be just like any other man. Don't get this confused and think that Samson's strength came from his hair. Samson's strength came from God. His hair was symbolic of that strength. So when she cuts his hair, it's not saying she cut his strength out. It's another covenant with God that he's broken. It's another way that he's failed God. God removes his strength from him. In the middle of the night, she's cut his hair. She says, Samson, the Philistines are here. He hops up, and he's ready to fight. And the saddest part about the story is that Samson doesn't realize his strength is gone. He thinks he's going to get up and just handle these men like he has in the past. But he can't. He's just like any other man. They take him, and they gouge his eyes out. Samson's third eye problem was that he had his eyes gouged out. Sunshine, we'll never see the sunshine again because he has gone so far to where he's been humiliated, he's been beaten, he's got his eyes gouged out, and now he's thrown in to sift the wheat in the dungeon, the basement, whatever you want to call it, wherever they held him. And he is at his lowest point in his life. He's drifted so far away from God that he has hit rock bottom, right? And the Bible says that Samson's hair start to grow on his head again. And while I'm sure this is true, that his hair does start to grow back, I think it's really saying Samson starts to think about this. He starts to consider all the things that has happened in his life, where he went from being the judge of Israel that everybody looked to help them get out of captivity to the Philistines, and a godly man who was living for God, to a man who is now here. He's got his eyes gouged out of his head. He's been humiliated. His hair's been cut. And he thinks, how did I get here? And it's just like he's on that ocean. And he's drifted so far out, and you think, how did I get here? And excuse me, when we look at the state of our country and we see all the things that are happening, and we think, how did we get here? Just like when Peter was walking on water to Jesus, and he looked down and he saw the waves, and he felt the storm, and he was scared, and he started to sink. He took his eyes off God. Samson had taken his eyes off God. Right? We as a country have taken our eyes off God. And so we find ourselves in these situations and ask, how did we get here? And it's evident we've taken our eyes off God. Samson realizes all that he's done. And he begins to pray that God will allow him to have one last moment of his strength. The Philistines were going to have a party at this big house, and they send this little servant boy to go get Samson. They're going to bring him out. He's going to be the entertainment. They're just going to have him out there to entertain everybody so they can laugh at him and spit at him and whatever else they want to do. So he brings him out, and Samson tells the servant boy to put his hands on the pillars. And so he's standing there, a hand on each pillar, and everybody's laughing at him. He begins to push on the pillars, and everybody's mocking him and joking about him. And all of a sudden, God gives him his strength back. And these pillars, they begin to move and crack. And the people's laughter changes to horror and screams. And before it's all said and done, Samson has pushed the pillars out, the house has fallen down, and he's killed himself along with 3,000 plus Philistines. You see, God still receives the glory. God still was able to get the Israelites out of Philistine control. But what I want you to see in this story is that Samson was living for God. He was a man of God, sent by God to do God's work. But because of sin in his life, because of his lustful eyes, because of his pride, he slowly began to drift away from God. You see, going this far away from God, it doesn't happen in a day. Just like people don't become alcoholics overnight. It's over a period of time until they get to that point. Samson didn't hit rock bottom overnight. Samson hit rock bottom over a series of events where he broke covenant after covenant after covenant with God. After he had sinned and drifted so far out, he couldn't hear God's voice anymore. He had forgotten where he got his strength. He had forgotten who had given him everything he had. He had forgotten how dependent he was on God. I don't know if anybody else realizes this today or not. We are totally dependent on God. When we think that we can handle something, no matter how big or small, we're foolish. You see, there's a king in 2 Chronicles named King Asa. And he had two battles in which he led Judah in fighting. The first battle was against the large army in which he trusted in God, and they were able to win that battle. The second battle was against Israel, where he went and took some of the gold out of the house of God to give to the Assyrians to come and help him win that battle against Israel, where it was a much smaller feat, right? It was a much smaller army he could have easily handled with the help of God, but he took it into his own hands because he thought, I can handle this. And while they won the war, while they won the battle here, he didn't trust in God. It eventually led to his death. He had a lot of diseases and things like that. We take our eyes off God and we think we can handle things, and we've become foolish, and we begin to drift away from God. You may have heard this before, but when it comes to dealing with sin, when we think in our lives that we can deal with our sin, that we don't really need God, even though we may not ever say that, we can see it in our actions. When we think that, when that is how we live our lives, we're basically saying that we're stronger than Samson. We know we're not stronger than Samson. I don't think any of y'all have ever killed a lion with your bare hands, right? Samson's the strongest man to ever live, and we can say that I can handle this sin. I don't need God. Well, Samson thought that too, and you saw what happened to him. We say that we're stronger than Samson. We say that we are wiser than Solomon. Solomon was the wisest man to ever live. Solomon had 700 wives and concubines. You know? I don't really know how wise that was, but we say we're wiser than Solomon, we're stronger than Samson, and we're more godly than David. David, a man after God's own heart. David, who saw Bathsheba taking her bath on the other roof and had to go have her, and then had her husband killed. David, who also gave in to sin. Solomon, who gave in to sin. Samson, who gave in to sin. All of those men took matters into their own hands and sinned against God. So when we think that we can handle whatever's going on in our life, do we really think that we're stronger than Samson? Or that we're wiser than Solomon? Or that we're more godly than David? Because I don't. And so what I want you to see today, maybe you are in sin. Maybe you have a sin that you've been struggling with for a while now. Maybe you've started to sin and you've seen some of the effects of it and you realize that you are drifting away from God. God wants you to turn back to Him. He's given you an opportunity today and every day to turn back to Him and say, God, I want to serve You, not myself, not anybody else. I can't beat this sin, not by myself. And He wants you to realize that you need Him. You may have heard the saying that God gives His toughest battles to His strongest soldiers. I don't know about that. I think God gives us all battles, not so that we can say that we're a strong soldier, not so that we can say that we've beat this, but so that we can see, God, I can't do this without You. I need You. The song that says, I need You every hour. It's not just in the big battles of life. It's not just when things are going wrong and you say, God, I don't have anywhere else to turn. I need You. It's in everything that we do. We need God. And I hope that you realize that today, and I hope that you can make that your prayer today, to always serve God, to always realize that we need God. As we sing a hymn invitation, if God's dealing with you, you allow Him to. Don't fight Him. Just allow Him to deal with you. Let's pray. Lord, we thank You for this day. God, we thank You for blessing us with the opportunity to be here today to worship You. We thank You for the story of Samson. Lord, the stories in the Bible that people have failed and failed again, and we can take those stories and hopefully learn from them. God, not just say it's a story we heard when we were younger and just brush it under the rug, Lord, but just, Lord, help us to take this to heart. To see that in our life we are much like Samson. We sin and we fail and we drift away from You, Lord, but I pray that we would never go as far as Samson. God, I pray that we would not be foolish enough to think that we can handle the things in this life that come our way, Lord, but realize that without You, we are nothing and we can do nothing. I pray today that if anybody here is in sin, if anybody here is struggling with something, Lord, they would lay that at Your feet and allow You to take care of it. Allow You to deal with it. God, I pray that we lean not on our own understanding, but that we acknowledge You in all of our ways and everything that we do. We love You and we praise You for blessing us. I ask all this in Your precious and holy name. Amen.